I often ask myself how I would have endured it. How would I have felt if my very first night as a husband or wife, my first moment of intimacy, had been watched by strangers standing in the room? Or if my parents had given me away at the age of 12, not out of love, but to gain a larger field or a better position in the village? Today, such ideas seem impossible. In medieval Europe, they were ordinary. Love carried no weight. Consent was a formality. And what took place behind closed doors was often far more disturbing than we like to believe. These are the hidden truths of medieval marriage. If you are drawn to the parts of history rarely spoken aloud, stay with this story. We have examined marriage in later centuries before, but now we must travel further back, to medieval Europe, and look honestly at what marriage truly meant in that world. In medieval society, marriage was never a personal decision. It was a transaction arranged by families to secure alliances, protect land, and improve social standing. There was nothing secretive about it. These arrangements were made openly, discussed publicly, and accepted as the natural order of life. The young people involved had no real choice. They were not expected to agree or disagree, only to comply. Decisions were made by parents, guardians, or local lords, often years before the children understood what marriage was. Formal betrothals were sometimes arranged when children were still very young, in some cases as early as 7 years old. These promises were sealed with payment. The groom's family provided a bride price or dowry, not as a symbol of affection, but as part of a binding agreement. Land, money, or goods were exchanged to secure the union. Once accepted, these payments made the arrangement nearly impossible to undo. If the marriage failed to happen, the bride's family often kept the dowry. Breaking the agreement could bring scandal, financial ruin, or even legal consequences. The church officially required verbal consent from both bride and groom. In theory, this protected individual choice. In reality, it changed very little. Families applied pressure until the required words were spoken. Girls were commonly married at 12, boys at 14. If a girl hesitated, relatives persuaded her. If persuasion failed, threats or violence often followed. A forced yes was still considered valid. That was enough. Marriage was not about love. It was about survival. For noble families, marriage was a matter of power and territory. For common people, it meant labor, food, and children who would one day work the land. In every case, a daughter was considered an asset. Her body promised heirs. Her name could strengthen alliances. A father might bind her to a man twice her age if it brought security, wealth, or protection. Among peasants, the logic was no different. A man might offer his daughter to a neighbor in order to join fields, share livestock, or survive hard seasons together. Her wishes were never part of the negotiation. Even kings and queens lived by the same rules. Henry II of England did not marry Eleanor of Aquitaine for affection. He married her to claim her lands. Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile were joined to unite Spain. Their feelings were irrelevant. What mattered was the map. Marriage had the power to shift borders, end wars, and reshape entire kingdoms. With a single agreement, the balance of power could change. Among common folk, marriages were less grand but just as binding. Young women were expected to marry close to home. A man who could plow fields, care for animals, and strengthen the household. These unions were still arranged by families, not chosen by the couple. A girl could be promised to the son of a family friend, sealed with a handshake and a modest payment. Her future was decided early, sometimes before she reached puberty. Love, as we understand it today, was rarely considered. Marriage was expected. It was arranged. And once agreed upon, it was final. From an early age, girls were prepared for this role. They were taught to spin thread, cook meals, serve others, and obey. Boys, in turn, were raised to provide, command the household, and claim a wife when the time came. When the proper age was reached, usually 12 for girls and 14 for boys, the union was formalized. In some cases, the bride and groom met for the first time on the day of their marriage. Betrothal itself carried legal weight. Rings were exchanged. Gifts changed hands. Even when the children involved barely understood what was happening, their families did, and that was what mattered. These agreements were protected by both law and religion. Breaking them could result in court cases, loss of land, or lasting shame. A family that tried to withdraw could be forced to pay compensation. Dowries were lost. Reputations collapsed. A broken betrothal was not a personal tragedy. It was a social failure. For that reason, families chose with care, but once a choice was made, obedience was expected. As the wedding day drew closer, attention turned to preparation. Clothing was sewn, food was gathered, and guests were summoned. Emotion played little role in what followed. A medieval wedding was not a private celebration. It was a public declaration, a signal that a new alliance now existed. The bride usually understood what awaited her. She was leaving her family behind, entering another household, and becoming part of a different man's domain. Her childhood ended at the church door. Beyond it stood the ceremony itself. In medieval Europe, weddings were commonly held outside the church. The priest or bishop positioned himself between the couple and the entrance, speaking sacred words while the village looked on. This setting allowed the church to bless the union and the community to witness it. Nothing about the moment was meant to be private. Everyone needed to see. Everyone needed to remember. The bride stood to the groom's left. Vows were spoken. Rings were placed on the fourth finger. These gestures still exist today, but in the Middle Ages their meaning was heavier. The ring was not simply a symbol of affection. It marked possession. It announced to the world that the woman now belonged to someone else. Often the ceremony continued inside with a mass, followed by loud and elaborate celebration. Music filled the air. Tables overflowed with food. Wealth was displayed openly. Wedding feasts could last for days, drawing guests from neighboring villages, and among noble families, even from distant lands. This was not only a marriage, it was a demonstration of power. Among all the rituals, one moment carried particular weight. The father took his daughter's hand and placed it into the groom's. This was not symbolic affection. It was a legal transfer. A girl passed from one man's authority to another's. Before marriage, she belonged to her father. After marriage, she belonged to her husband. In many medieval kingdoms, women could not own property, travel freely, or make legal decisions without male approval. Marriage did not change this reality. It confirmed it. Responsibility was transferred. Control followed. The bride herself was part of the agreement. Even the veil, a tradition still seen today, served a different purpose then. It was not decoration. It was protection, not for the woman, but for the contract. In many arranged marriages, especially among the nobility, the bride and groom had never met. The bride remained veiled and silent throughout the ceremony. Only after the final words were spoken could the groom lift the veil and see her face. If he was disappointed, it no longer mattered. The agreement was already sealed. The veil protected the deal. Some grooms arrived armed. The best man, once known as the bride's guard, stood beside the couple not to hold rings or offer speeches, but to enforce the ceremony. If the bride attempted to flee, he restrained her. If someone tried to disrupt the marriage or carry her away, he fought them. His presence was a reminder that weddings were not always peaceful occasions. Some brides resisted, some families argued, some rivals attacked. Marriage, even on its most celebrated day, was never entirely safe. Marriage could begin in tension. The presence of the best man ensured that it ended in control. Every element of the ceremony reinforced a single message: the position of the bride, the movement of her body from her father's hand into her husband's, the veil that concealed her face, the man standing guard beside her, the sword at his side. Each symbol spoke clearly. Her life was no longer hers to shape. It now belonged to her husband. And yet, the ceremony itself was only the beginning. After the feast ended, after the musicians departed and the wine lost its warmth, the most important moment of a medieval marriage arrived: the first wedding night. In the Middle Ages, a bride was expected to be a virgin. Her virginity was treated as proof of purity, obedience, and family honor. A woman's body carried the reputation of her father, her brothers, and her future husband. The Church taught that intimacy before marriage was a grave sin. A girl was left with two paths. She could remain celibate and enter a convent, or she could marry and bear children. There was no third option. As Christianity spread across Europe between the 5th and 10th centuries, its moral rules shaped women's lives more deeply than almost any other force. By the 11th century, particularly among the nobility, a girl's virginity became a matter of law, inheritance, and political stability. A nobleman needed certainty that his firstborn child was truly his heir. Without medical knowledge and with no way to prove biological parentage, the only accepted guarantee was a woman's innocence on her wedding night. If she had never been with another man, then the child she carried could belong only to her husband. For this reason, families, especially noble ones, demanded proof. This expectation gave rise to a custom known as the test of virginity. After the couple's first intimate union, the bed linens were examined for blood. If blood appeared, it was taken as evidence that the bride had been untouched and that her husband was her first. In some households, the stained sheet was shown privately to family members. In others, it was displayed openly before the wedding guests. This was done to protect the husband's honor and confirm the legitimacy of future children. Among noble families, failure to produce such proof could bring disaster. A questioned bride risked annulment of the marriage. Alliances could collapse. Families could lose land, status, and political power. The woman herself might be dismissed, stripped of her title, or confined to a convent. In royal dynasties, accusations of impurity could spark civil wars. If a queen's honor was challenged, her children could be declared illegitimate and removed from succession. A single doubt was enough to unravel years of careful planning. Among peasants, the consequences were different, but no less cruel. In villages, a sheet without blood could invite mockery, punishment, or violence. Rumors spread quickly. Judgment was public and unforgiving. In small communities where reputation meant survival, a girl could be cast out and left to fend for herself. The law offered little protection. The village enforced its own justice through shame and exile. And if all of this seems disturbing, what followed could be worse. In some regions, another belief existed, one whispered about, feared, and rarely challenged. A practice known as eupremia noctis, or the rite of the first night. According to this belief, A feudal lord had the right to spend the wedding night with a peasant bride before her husband. It was a display of dominance, a reminder of who truly held power. Some historians argue that the practice was largely symbolic, enforced through taxes or payments rather than physical acts. Others suggest it occurred rarely, but quietly. In either case, it revealed who claimed authority over a woman's body. Medieval writings, legends, and legal records show how deeply this belief was embedded. In parts of France and Spain, peasants paid money to avoid the rite. In some regions, the church itself collected fees to waive it. Royal decrees were later issued to ban the practice, a sign that, in some form, it had existed. Epic poems and popular tales described it openly. People knew of it, they feared it, and many accepted it as part of their world. Even then, the newly married couple was not left alone. Another ritual awaited them, the bedding ceremony. In many parts of Europe, family members and guests escorted the couple to their bed. A priest might bless it. Music played, songs were sung, often crude and mocking. In some cases, guests helped undress the bride and groom. They were placed into bed together, in full view of the crowd. Privacy was a luxury few were allowed. Curtains were drawn, and the guests withdrew, or at least appeared to. In some places, they did not leave at all. Under the most intrusive customs, witnesses remained close, waiting for proof that the marriage had been completed. In Iceland, at least 6 men were required to witness the bedding in order for the union to be considered valid. In certain German towns, entire communities gathered outside the chamber, while drums and pipes played loudly, masking the sounds within. Among noble families, the bedding ritual carried enormous weight. Dynasties depended on the couple fulfilling their duty that very night. In Scotland, even the simple act of being seen together in bed could be enough to declare a marriage legally binding. In parts of Europe, refusing the bedding ceremony raised suspicion. A couple who resisted risked accusations of fraud or deception. And once the night had passed, control did not loosen. It tightened. The church stepped in again, this time to regulate intimacy itself. Strict rules governed when a married couple could touch one another. Physical relations were forbidden on Sundays, Thursdays, and Fridays. During Lent and other holy seasons, intimacy was completely banned. Couples were also expected to abstain during a woman's monthly cycle, throughout breastfeeding, and for 40 days after childbirth. According to church teaching, intimacy was permitted only to produce children. Pleasure, passion, and desire were considered sinful. Some religious authorities calculated that a married couple should be intimate no more than once a week, sometimes even less. The church also taught that a wife could not refuse her husband's request for intimacy. This obligation was known as the marital debt. A husband could demand it, and a wife was expected to comply. Refusal could be judged as a sin. The same standard did not apply in reverse. If a husband denied his wife, it was considered far less serious. And once married, a woman's responsibilities multiplied. From the moment the vows were spoken, she was expected to fulfill her primary social function, bearing children. A woman's value within marriage was measured by how quickly she conceived and how many children she produced. In a world of disease, famine, and poor hygiene, survival was uncertain. Many children died before their first birthday. Families depended on large numbers of births to ensure that a few would live long enough to work, inherit, or rule. Marriage was not truly complete until an heir was born. Among nobles, this meant a male child. Daughters had value through future marriages, but a son meant security. A son meant power. A son carried the family name forward. If a woman gave birth to a boy, she protected her family's future. If she did not, she became a liability. During the 11th and 12th centuries, this pressure only intensified. The rise of feudalism and the expanding influence of the church reshaped family life. Noble women were expected to produce heirs for political reasons. Their bodies became tools of dynastic planning. Those who failed were often replaced. Some disappeared quietly. Others were publicly discarded, as in the case of Queen Bertha of the Netherlands. Her husband, King Philip III of France, claimed she was too large and undesirable. In truth, her failure was simpler. She had not given him a son. Philip replaced her with another woman, already married, and ignored repeated warnings from the church. Among peasants, the system was no kinder. Women were expected to give birth while continuing to work the land. A woman might be heavily pregnant and still harvest crops or carry water for hours each day. Her fertility kept the household alive. Each child meant another pair of hands. Losing a child meant more labor, fewer workers, and deeper poverty. Yet no one reduced these expectations. Women were expected to try again and again, regardless of the cost to their bodies. Childbirth itself was dangerous. There were no trained doctors, no clean instruments, and no pain relief. A single mistake during labor could lead to death from bleeding or infection. Still, women gave birth 5, 10, sometimes even 15 times. Some survived. Many did not. Each pregnancy carried risk, and each time the community expected them to be ready for the next. When they were not pregnant, women managed the household. Noble women oversaw servants, organized estates, and hosted guests. Peasant women did everything themselves: cooking, cleaning, farming, spinning wool, raising children, and caring for animals. That may have been the only moment of control they were allowed. For a few hours a day, something was theirs to command. And by now, a pattern begins to emerge. Yes, the church played a central role in medieval marriage, but its influence was often darker than it appeared. Though marriage was declared sacred, women entered it already unequal. The church then reinforced ideas that made escape nearly impossible. One of the clearest was the demand for obedience. This principle came directly from Scripture, particularly the writings of Paul the Apostle. In Ephesians 5:22 he wrote, "Wives, submit yourselves unto your husbands, as unto the Lord." This line was copied into countless medieval marriage ceremonies. Across Europe, brides publicly promised obedience, while husbands promised protection. From that moment on, their roles were fixed. Authority rested with the man. Within the household, his word was final. A wife who disagreed with her husband had no legal path to challenge him. Church doctrine taught that it was her Christian duty to serve, obey, and remain loyal, regardless of the cost. Even in cases of cruelty, the church rarely intervened. Violence within marriage was treated as a private matter, not a legal one. There was a concept known as moderate punishment. According to this belief, a husband was permitted to discipline his wife as long as he acted with restraint. What restraint meant was never clearly defined. Ecclesiastical courts only became involved if violence grew extreme or publicly scandalous. For most women, this meant no protection at all. A man who struck his wife often faced no consequences. Leaving the marriage was nearly impossible. Divorce was forbidden. Marriage was considered a permanent sacrament. Only in rare circumstances could it be annulled: if the couple had been too young, if one partner was not Christian, or if one had taken religious vows. Abuse was never considered a valid reason. A woman who tried to flee often had nowhere to go. Her family might refuse to accept her back. Society would shame her. The church would send her home. In a few regions, particularly parts of Germany, local customs offered strange alternatives. One of them was known as divorce by combat. When a marriage completely collapsed, a couple could agree to resolve their dispute through a public fight. The man stood waist-deep in a pit, one hand bound. The woman faced him with a sack of stones. The winner earned the right to end the marriage. The fight was brutal, humiliating, and conducted before a crowd. The church officially condemned the practice, but where local traditions held greater authority, it continued. Through its teachings and its silences, the church helped shape a world in which women possessed few rights within marriage and almost no path to escape it. The institution that claimed to guard the sanctity of marriage did little to protect those living inside it. Much has changed since then. Marriage remains important, but today it is shaped by ideals of consent, dignity, and mutual respect. Looking back at medieval practices, we see a world where sacred vows were used to bind people to suffering. And for this chapter of history as well, we can say with certainty, it is fortunate we were not born into it.